Hello and welcome to the conversation today. How are you,
Hello.
Sebastian? How are you, Peter?
Thank
Great.
you. Hello. Nice to see you
Hello.
again.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Excellent, excellent. We definitely welcome all of our guests just to kind of get started all around. This is part of the inaugural kickoff for the Antifragility Institute. My name is Sai, and I have the great pleasure and honor of being with Peter and Sebastian today, as we did our previous session. Before we dive into introductions, I'm just going to set a little bit of context, and we'll by all means dive in a little bit. In particular, really here we're looking at really exposing ourselves to the topic a little bit, talking a little bit about what we've learned from a practice perspective around risk and anti-fragility, and really just doing an exploratory conversation. Again, just to kick us off and out of the gate. Not looking for right and wrong by any stretch, as whatever right and wrong may mean, and really not going ahead and looking for, too much depth other than that exploration, like we said. And there's more to come by all means. So that's the context of what we're doing around risk and anti-fragility. The other key thing I really want to emphasize, and Peter and Sebastian definitely concur, we do want to engage with questions and insights from the group. So please don't hesitate to post questions in the comments, and we'll definitely interact in that way. And without too much more rambling from my side, Sebastian, I would love for you to introduce yourself and tell us more about who you are and help us dive in, my friend.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Sai. Hi, Peter. And a few sentences about me, why I'm here, and why I'm co-founder of the Antifragility Institute. I almost worked 12 years in aerospace industry. First of all, as an auditor, then as the chief audit executive, and last 2 years as a chief GRC officer. So I manage the risk, or I challenge the risk in the aerospace company. But afterwards, I challenge myself. I open a few businesses. One is in Poland, the other one is UK, and I try to also sell what I know about the risk. So it's mostly about the consulting services, information security, cyber security, compliance, and risk, and also the privacy. It's my main expertise. So this is the idea. But also what I'm interested in my private life. So I trying to challenge myself, my mind, my body. That's why I trained more than 15 years of martial arts. I also run, climb, I scuba dived, and so on. Right now, I'm very interested in the breathing techniques like Wim Hof techniques and oxygen advantage techniques. So I try to explore myself, try to experiment with what I feel in different circumstances. Sometimes I exposing myself for cold, sometimes for very warm temperature or hot temperature. It's quite interesting how we can handle with different things that could challenge ourselves. Okay, I think it's enough.
You're tremendous, Sebastian. All around. Peter, would love to hear your voice, my friend.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I worked almost 25 years in the industry and public sector with the highest risk level as a chief audit executive, data protection officer and privacy manager, and chief governance risk compliance officer. The governance risk and compliance I found as very important matters in the rapidly changing world. I also worked as an external consultant and auditor, especially in IT. security, business continuity management, and risk management projects for the biggest companies in the Polish and international financial, energy, and banking sectors. For example, for bank, I am fascinated by combining business with the psychology of behavior, and that is why I'm particularly close to risk management. Compliance, especially in the rapidly changing technological and IT projects, as well as blockchain application. And I am many years deputy director of internal audit department and internal auditor at Warsaw University of Technology. For 9 years, I was employee the National Bank of Poland, including 6 years in the internal audit department and 3 years in the strategic management team. Since 21 years as an owner, private business, and I was co-author of the first National Bank of Poland management strategy. And I am certified compliance officer, co-author at the Wolters Kluwer IT system to support governance's compliance processing. Why Antifragility Institute? I would like to share my knowledge about human behavior in the business. I'm interested in psychology and play the piano. Now, I hope that new technologies should generate in people's mind unconventional and non-schematic ways of reacting. I would like others to learn that it is worth using the best standards and practices in business to be resilient in response to inevitable threats that modern world constantly generates.
Excellent. So thank you for before we dive in deeper. Let me just throw out a few more sort of tidbits about kind of us three and myself in particular and what have you before we dive in. So I have to tell you, I love the background of Peter and Sebastian very openly because it is wide and deep. And likewise, I hope to contribute similarly. Just ever so briefly, I've been a coach and consultant and practitioner very, very keenly for 40 plus years, really focusing on transformation and change in every aspect, the human dynamics aspect, and very much in the same vein as Peter, you mentioned the psychology of it, as well as the other aspects of it that you both have. And in particular, I really partner with individuals, groups, and organizations to help calibrate very, very key pillars, all the way from the marketplace, business, if you will, strategy, leadership, culture, execution, technology. So a wide spectrum. And the focus for me has been over the years really around the core foundation of resilience, if you will, anti-fragility, agility, and that's one substrate, I'll say. The other substrate is risk and uncertainty and complexity, and most definitely change, disruption, and crisis. So a lot of stories, a lot of things that come in from that vantage point. As I like to say, I have very little hair because I have, at this point, absorbed potentially as much as I can. So I appreciate the partnership with definitively Peter, Sebastian, and the community. So as we mentioned, we definitely want to keep this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to pose questions, comments to our audience. And Peter and Sebastian, let's dive into your thoughts. Risk and uncertainty and anti-fragility. What do you think?
Okay, so maybe I will start. Okay, first of all, why I was interested in the anti-fragility, and at the beginning in the Black Swan and afterwards in the anti-fragility. It's because the fast-changing environment and very complicated ecosystem we live in. So not only the business on the environment perspective, but also individual perspective, because our body is also very non-linear, but not linear, very specific and very complicated ecosystem. And as I mentioned, I also interested from the business perspective in the information security risk, cyber security. And from this perspective, in today's world, it's very hard to use the standard risk techniques, like in the world that everything is stable. You could use linear connection between one event and another, and that's why it's much more from the risk perspective. It's about uncertainty and the impact, but not only about the probability of the event. So that's why when I'm looking at especially from my client's perspective, from the cyber security perspective, it's much better to evaluate the impact on the client. And even in the cyber security, supply chain, and so on. So it's better, or it's the only way of evaluate the impact than trying to evaluate something as probability that it's very hard or even impossible to quantify.
Thank you, Sebastian. Peter, what are your thoughts, my friend? Oh, you're on mute, Peter.
I'm sorry. In my perspective, there is no single definition of risk. The definition of ISO 27001 is that risk is an effect of uncertainty on an organization objectives. Risk is a possibility, probability that something will go wrong. Risk is an undertaking whose outcome is uncertain, unknown, problematic, the probability of failure, the exposure, daring to dangers, the danger of harm, anything that stands or may stand in the way of achieving business goals. Risk accompanies the situation in which we make decisions. Acting with the limits is the law perspective. Acting with the limits of acceptable risk minimizes the liability of offender. This is a important risk perspective. Any risk is a relative category and not absolutely. It can be monetary or non-monetary. The correlations of the risk are uncertainty, fear, anxiety. It is a continuous process that affects the entire organization and is influenced by employees at all levels in the organization, as is directly related to adapted strategy of the organization, aims to identify and manage risks in accordance with accepted risk appetite, and enables reasonable assurance to be given to the institution authorities that the institution objectives will be achieved. Risk is not a catastrophe for me. It becomes one if you sweep it under the carpet.
Well said. Well said. And from my vantage point, kind of really tying in a few of the threads that you've both contributed, the world is random. When we are born, we have no idea what's happening to us, let alone. The world is random. When it becomes acknowledged, that randomness becomes almost personal in some way, we start to call it uncertainty, because now I'm experiencing something. And then when I try to control how I'm experiencing that thing, so awareness is one leap. As soon as I try to control it, then it becomes if you will, risk. So in many ways, especially now, I think the risk world in particular, and I'm using that word a little bit generically, very much in the same vein that Peter, you mentioned, and Sebastian, you mentioned, we're going through a renaissance of what does risk really mean? What's it not mean? And very much we have, we've embraced risk historically to confront the illusion of certainty. And it truly is an illusion. So there are positives, there are negatives, and we have to overcome our addictions to stability. And that's one thing I love, Sebastian, as you mentioned, there's numerous ways that you impact yourself, right, to achieve greater anti-fragility, not an absolute concept, and overcome those constraints that we make say as a risk or as an uncertainty or ultimately originating in randomness. So I'll say, especially for the business world, where we've presumed and we've embraced our addiction to stability, and we've done that through this illusion of certainty, now we're piercing through it. And anti-fragility is a true mechanism amongst resilience and agility, amongst other things, to do that. So very multifaceted. Very multifaceted. Sebastian and Pierre, if I can ask a question, kind of to push the conversation forward. If the business world was to say, Sebastian, Peter, Sai, what's one recommendation that you would give us? What might that be?
Yeah, just one. Okay, so maybe two, because just one could be not enough. First of all, do not let you killed. So do not take too much risk or expose yourself for the biggest possible risk that you could die, or the organization could collapse, or could happen. Very big event that could destroy the organization or destroy team or the person. It's one way. So look at the highest risk or the highest impact. It is one recommendation. And the second recommendation is take as much risks, but or expose for many risks, but with not very big volume of this, or not very big impact for those kind of risks from on organization level and also in the private team level. So do not, let's say, use the way that you are stagnant or nothing happened. You have to live, or the organization should live in like that. So this way. So expose for not very high, rather low risks, but very often.
So forgive me, Peter. So in many ways, Sebastian, don't let the past limit your future. In kind of what I hear you're expressing in so many ways.
Yeah. And also do not be stagnant. You have to evolve every time. Every time you expose for a new risk, if it's failure, nothing happened. You evolve. You have to evolve during this time.
Yep. Forgive me, forgive me, Peter. You were chiming in. My apologies.
No. I'm short. Don't be afraid of risk. Befriend the risk. It's not scary. If you ignore it, you will die in business. Risk is crucial, very important the factor of the business, and don't hesitate contact for us if you have any troubles with the risk. Short. That.
Well said. So so risk is not always negative, and this is, I think, part of the historical aspect that the renaissance of the risk management world is going through at this point. So definitely,
yeah. Risk will be is chance. It's chance. In the business.
Did you have more, Peter, or can I chime in with a few thoughts as well? Anything else, Peter?
No, thank you.
All good, my friend. All good. I think one of the key things that you're both emphasizing and how we've approached risk historically is we've used it as a restriction, as really, if you will, as a negative. One is we need to look at it from a not only a threat perspective, but an opportunity perspective as well, because risk can create, if you will, and identify opportunities. And this is extremely key. Innovation requires stepping into risk. Leadership requires stepping into risk, if you will, in an uncertain world that is even seemingly random, if I push it further. So we are going through that renaissance. If I were to kind of take the same question I posed to both of you, one thing that I would say to leaders, to organizations, is really deal with reality, deal with human nature and who you are, because risk brings those together in a very, very pointed way, and anti-fragility, if you will, as well. Good to take a question, gentlemen, from I think, is it Marcin? Forgive me if I mispronouncing it, but there's a question that that's being offered.
Yeah. Okay, Martin. I think in both situations, taking the risk is something the organization should do in every, like I said, in every situation. Even the bigger organization, because if you are thinking about big corporation, they're not interesting, especially inside. So the team inside, the employee inside, in most cases, they are afraid of taking the risks. Because if they take the risk and they fail, they will be punished. Mm-hmm. So the in smaller organizations like startups, it's natural because it's the startups are high risk investments, high risk organization, and they have to be agile and they are facing a lot of more risks than the multinational corporation. But the idea of taking smaller risks, it's the same for small organization, medium organization, multinational corporation, government organization. That's why it's also very important to have a very good internal culture of not blaming for taking those risks, but supporting people to do this, because from this kind of ideas and the taking the risk, the organization evolve and could change according to the world, according to the business, and according to the competition, and so on. That's why it's so important from my perspective and my experience.
I would like to answer the Marcin question. For my perspective, practical perspective, there are not quiet seas in the business. Risk is constant vigilance, constant struggle, and that character storms and storms. And from my perspective, quiet sea is impossible in practice. This is management miracles. My business, since 25 years, that constant vigilance and not quiet.
Thank you, Peter and Sebastian. If I add a little bit of commentary to the question, I think it's a very powerful question in many ways. Is more risk, less risk better? If we look at an ecosystem and look at the different players, and we look at it from a risk vantage point and an uncertainty vantage point. So I'm blending those two elements together. Risk becomes a level playing field between the big players and the small players, and it becomes a level playing field because if the smaller organizations are positioned, the smaller players are positioned to leverage that risk, then it's very powerful in their favor. They can also be overwhelmed by it. So if we look at an ecosystem vantage point, then it really does, if you will, provide opportunities and innovation for the smaller players. So if there isn't enough risk as a small player, generate risk, quite honestly. If there's too much risk, make sure you can survive, and then think about what risk you can leverage to thrive. So that's very, very key. The other piece that you mentioned, Marcin, is the quiet C, and I love the way you're expressing it. The stronger organization preferring the quiet C. For the larger organizations, and I say larger size-wise, but also stronger, if the stronger organizations prefer the quiet C, then they're being less innovative. Then essentially someone can sneak up and then ultimately do them in. It's a matter of time. The biggest players have historically gone through some of these things. There's a book, forgive me, I forgot the author's name now, Good to Great. If you look at the research that was done, I can't remember the author if you remember it, but a lot of those organizations have diminished their standpoint. They were very strong at a point in time. They embraced the quietness, but they didn't embrace really anti-fragility and becoming stronger from disorder. So there's a real balance that has to be found in that ecosystem. But a great question to explore. So thank you for that. Should we take another question, gentlemen?
Maybe, or maybe some thoughts from me about taking or do not taking to high risk from maybe not from the business world, but from my private experience. A few months ago, I was climbing with one of my friends on the highest peak in Poland. It was almost the winter, so there was a snow, ice in the mountains, and we were not well prepared for those kind of weather. And I think around 80 till 50 meters, we said to ourselves, okay, we think that it's too dangerous for us. We climbed enough height. It was quite nice journey, but we don't want to fall and probably die. And that's why we said, okay, it's maybe nothing will happen, but maybe it will. The impact for us was too big to just climb or said, okay, we climb the mountain or stand at the peak of this mountain, but we said, okay, it's too dangerous, and we come back. And I think it was quite nice idea about the risk management, because of course the goal was to climb the peak or stand in the peak, but at the end, much more important was to survive than to accomplish this goal. So that's why we come back, and I think this kind of decision, it's a very important one. Even not in this kind of mountains, in the bigger mountains like Alps or Himalayas, I think the most important decisions is to leave this and go down if it's only 100 meters to the top.
Peter, you're on mute, my friend.
Yes, thank you. I would like to explain and answer to a question. Enemies. We above all tell the truth about our business strengths and weakness, about opportunities and about risks. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. I know that what I say might not be popular, but in consulting, I have to be first of all ethical and honest. And I can't tell someone they are really silent and say when they are not. This is my first point of view. I hope that my answer will be polite.
All good, definitely. I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, and a lot of humanity to what you're saying, because you got to be who you are, and that's the only way to be authentic all around, Peter. So thank you for that. If I could add one thing before we take another, if you will, question, and there's numerous stories and definitely more to come. I know we're about halfway in our session here. There's definitively a survival aspect, similar to Sebastian, as you're emphasizing, right? Do we go up the mountain? Don't we go up? There's a survival aspect. And then there's how much do we push ourselves to thrive without, I'll use Taleb's term, without falling into ruin, or essentially I'll use the term that I like to use, without dying, quite simply. So surviving and thriving without dying is a very key balance. That balance is an integration. And I think what the challenge is now, and this is going to tie into David Page's question here in a minute, the challenge for us now is how do we find that integrative balance? So we're surviving and thriving without dying. And it really balances these three sort of perspectives. One of them is being risk averse. So you can't be so risk averse that you don't thrive, and you can't be so risk averse that you don't survive. That's one. And then the other perspective is, if you will, being, I'll say, risk inclined or risk taking or risk seeking. So risk taking, so risk inclined that you always are about to die, and then you're unable to thrive, let alone survive. It just goes right to too extreme. And the challenge really at the end of the day, and this goes back to what I would say to leaders and organizations, the challenge is to be risk savvy, if you will. Find that balance, find that integration point, very much in the same way, Sebastian, that you mentioned it, and the humanity that you mentioned, Peter, as well. So many stories that I think we can share. Gentlemen, are you good to take another question? Because I'd love to get your thoughts on some of Andy's thinking. You're good, Peter, with another excellent. So let's take in a little bit of what Andy is what Andy shared with us here, if you will. Today's world, more fragility. How can we make change? Not our enemy, not risk, but opportunity. Any thoughts, gentlemen?
It's. I could also give some examples. I think it's much more interesting examples, especially from the private perspective, private life. As I said before, I'm right now I'm more focused on the breathing techniques, but it started from the Wim Hof. So exposing for the cold and for the ice. So the change, it's because you are not exposing for something that could harm you and kill you, because you have to do it step by step. And I started this way. So I started from the cold showers. I bought a barrel, and in the winter I go into the barrel that it's stay outside in my garden. And during the winter, it's sometimes for me it's a challenge, and sometimes it's fun, because if it's -10 and you try to break the ice in this barrel and get in for just 1 to 3 minutes, not more, because the idea is to challenge yourself, but not to force yourself. So you are challenging yourself. Your body become much more powerful, much more resilient, and also much more anti-fragile. It is the one example. And right now, because it's summer, it's hard to expose for cold in Poland, except as I said, the cold showers. I try to expose for heat. So it's same idea, but different different exposure. So I'm running in the highest temperature during the day. So if it's 30 or above 30, it's the great for me. It's the great temperature for run. But what is really really important, I don't run too long, because I try. Let's say I'm not forcing myself. I'm challenging myself. So I'm taking not the highest risk. I'm taking enough risk for me in this particular situation, and that's why I'm become more anti-fragile. If you are thinking about the temperature, the exposure for the heat or for cold, and right now I feel much better after this kind of exposure. If it's cold or if it's really really hot, I don't feel it like I felt a few years ago. So maybe this could help you with the understanding of the change, or the taking small risks.
Yeah. Peter, did you want to add anything, or
in my perspective, agility and risk management is not just about reacting. Agility is also the ability to generate the future in order to better respond to it. For example, changes in the IT project can generate new risks. With anti-fragility in mind, we can design the better. Then the risk of success of the project can be significantly lower. Risk management is, in my perspective, practical perspective, is the fundamental of anti-fragility. Anti-fragility is wrong if risk management is declarative, apparent, epidermal, many externally unverifiable activities in it. Low level of in Poland, for example, we have a problem with low level of computerization of risk management processes and incident hiding. In perspective, data protection officer, quality of the personal data, especially personal data about risk management, is a problem. Not identified risk appetite by the management of boards, low level of internal audit, and Anti-Fragility Institute. We want to build a community of passionate people who are determined not only to achieve goals in short-term perspective, but in achieving goals, they strengthen themselves. They become resilient thanks to the strength of character. You are resilient and you can do better in business. React to risk, better prevent it, and solve problems.
Yeah. And if I add, I love the example that you're both using and elaborating. Sebastian, specifically with yours, ages ago, I got a chance to visit the Turkish baths in Budapest, actually, and where you go in sub-zero temperature bath, right? And then you jump out into very, very hot bath. And one of the key factors is very critically is time. How much time you spend and how much exposure you have in that environment. And then what risk do you take to survive? Because if you spend too much time in a particular condition and then go to the other condition, you can go into shock, actually. So, and trauma. So very much in the same vein that you're describing. And this applies to business. I'm gonna address Andy's question likewise with a bit of a quick story, if that's all right. Very much in the same vein from the business context in particular. When actually let me get to the let me say the end line before I go to the beginning. The bottom line relative to fragility and making change our friend, I think the key thing is friend has a positive notion to it. To be honest, it's not positive or negative. It just is. It has aspects of both. There's friend and foe in everything. So we need to look at change as both positive and negative simultaneously. It's paradoxical. In that way, then we can begin to determine what do I look at in terms of a survival mode or a thriving mode. So you may say, gosh, that's just a very, very esoteric statement. Here's the way we make it extremely practical. When COVID hit here in the United States, I had a lot of clients call me up and say, we don't know what to do. And I said, okay, well, let's gather your leadership team ever so quickly. And we gathered the leadership team and said, okay, so what are we going to do? And I said, well, at this point, I just want you to begin to elaborate, what's volatile in your world, what's uncertain, what's complex, and what's ambiguous. Similarly, just begin to tell me, what do you think is really more stable versus uncertain? What's more certain? What's volatile? What's more stable? What's more simple than complex? And what's more clear versus ambiguous? That quickly began to get the conversation going as to what they saw in their environments, the marketplace, their clients. Well, these clients are more stable. These clients are more uncertain. Our team members, internally and externally. That was one aspect, really VUCA, if you will. Very, very quickly now, we look at that and we say, okay, what's the next thing that we want to look at? I said, okay, this goes to what Peter, you mentioned. What are our strengths and what are our weaknesses? Just help me understand, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Because now we can begin to put this into context. What are the opportunities and threats that we experience relative to all these other pieces? And they began to identify things. And they said, Sai, there are no opportunities right now other than survival. This goes right back to Sebastian. As you mentioned, survival before thriving. I said, okay, now that we've got this understanding, and very, very quickly, I said, okay, now what decisions do we have to make and what actions do we have to take to survive? Immediately, we identified some decisions, actions, we started to do them. Next day, we did the same thing. What that started to do is to generate a degree of stability. And at that point, essentially, we made change, our friend and our enemy simultaneously. We generated, back to what Peter, you mentioned. And then as the days began to open up, we began to recognize opportunities. We began to recognize greater stability and greater ability to deal with the unknown and uncertainty. That pattern of VUCA, UDA, if you will, and strengths, weaknesses, opportunities is very, very powerful to confront a crisis mode, etc. And that's just one sort of example to consider. But definitively, a lot more to come out. Gentlemen, are you okay with taking a few more questions? I think we've got some good questions, and likewise, in addition to Andy's. Okay, good. David Page contributed this next one, so would love to kind of get some conversation around this one here, around the pandemic and addressing some of the public and private sector, building anti-fragility into those services and what have you. And hopefully, David, we've talked a little bit about that, but please, Sebastian, Peter, would love to hear your thoughts even further.
It's fun, David, because before we started the webinar, we was talking about the book I'm reading right now. It's Ken Robinson, the professor Ken Robinson book about the education system, and that's why I'm laughing a bit, because we're talking about 1 hour ago, and I'm reading it because my daughter is right now in the kindergarten, but in 1 year and a half. She will go to the school, and of course I've got a problem because I don't like the idea of today's education system, that it's built on I think 19th or even 18th century education system. So in those systems we have to learn something and do not create something or learn the skills, but the kids have to learn some facts and so on. And in today's world, it's easy to open, let's say, Wikipedia or Google and find anything you are interested in. So my idea of looking for education system for my daughter, it's looking for the place that she could learn the skills, and it will be she will be all the or every kid will be in the center. Not the system will be in the center, but kids will be in the center of the system, and not the system itself. And one by one, learning the skills, not anything special. So not the file, math or the language or the history or IT. The skills, how to communicate with other kids, how to learn, sometimes how to unlearn the things that are not very useful in today's world, because the world is changing so rapidly that sometimes it's really important to forget something that we learned 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So it's it's hard for me to do this, because it's really hard to find this the place it will be the perfect place for my daughter to educate her, and to not create too much pressure on her. Of course, the pressure, or like I said, the experiment is good, but not too much of this. I really like the idea of the Scandinavian education system. I don't know if you know anything about it, but it's really fun to read how these kids in the Scandinavia are education, how the education system in the Scandinavia looks like. It's quite interesting. I'm not expert in the public health sector, so I don't think it's good that I will share anything vital for this topic, except the education.
Any thoughts, Peter?
David, thank you for the question. I work in a hospital as an internal auditor and IT auditor. In the pandemic, this is a drama for many people, real misery. But I find that any investment in your own immune system is building antifragility. The healthcare system will face the prospect of systematic crisis. It is a permanent crisis. The population is aging. Many people are living without looking at the consequences of their health actions. And you have to count on your resilience and your antifragility first, and then on the antifragility on the system. Today, companies cannot afford not to manage risk. Risk management can be very expensive and ineffective if you are not anti-fragile, in my perspective.
Well said on both your parts. And if I add to it, it's a great question. One of the key things, I think, that two thoughts I want to contribute, and then we'll definitely get into a little bit more questions in addition to what the gentlemen have already contributed. Agility is different than anti-fragility, and I think that's very, very key. Agility is very much a response, a generative response, exactly as we've mentioned. And anti-fragility, if you will, really focuses on evolution and growing from that disruption. So the reason I mention that is we carry our history. So in a lot of history, we look at the word failure, if you will, as a negative. And we attach a negative to failure. And as much as we've done that, what we really need to do, and especially in the education system, and I'll use my daughter as an example here in a minute. When she was growing up, any experience, right? Something she's going to experience as a failure, something she's going to experience as a success. What I tried to do as she was growing up is refocus her on the experience. if you refocus on the experience, she's going to look for more experiences to grow. And at that point, if you will, achieve greater anti-fragility, very much in that growth mode, and not get locked up, if you will, in assigning negative or positive to the things that she's experiencing. So the reason I share that is I think the same thing really has to occur in our education system, in our public services, etc. Is we need to again, going through a renaissance, relook at the lens through which we see the world. Very openly, and I'm very public about it. I grew up in downtown Detroit area, where my parents were told that by the age of 20, I was either going to be dead or in prison. You choose. So how did I overcome some of those challenges? Very much in the same vein of experiences and looking at them in a specific lens. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, like Sebastian and Pierre have mentioned. Gentlemen, how about we take one more question, if you will, and then we start closing, just to be respectful of time. Does that work for both of you, Sebastian and Peter?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
One more
question.
Yeah, one more question, and then we'll do some closing thoughts. Here's our next one to take a look at.
Oh God.
This is a great question.
Yeah, it's of course it's a great question, but you have to know the credit risk management system in banks. I think it depends. Is it corporate credit risk management or the individual credit risk management? It could be a bit different, because in one, especially in the individual credit risk management, it's a bit easier, because we've got much more volume of individuals, and probably the risk in every case will be much less than in the credit risk if you are thinking about the corporate credit risk management, because it's about the volume of the credit you give individual or the organization. So that's why I think right now, I think the credit risk for individuals, in Poland, it's quite stable, and it's because the regulator is very strong, and the safety mechanism are very, very strong. That's why I don't see the risk in the credit risk management for individuals. I don't know how it's going on for enterprises. So that's why maybe you guys could ask these questions. It's beyond my expertise. Sorry, It's really beyond one.
So a lot of nuances to your point.
Yeah.
Peter.
Credit risk make you aware that you do not know what will happen to you in 3 months, and you take a loan for 25 years. It's a miracle. You have to be very anti-fragility. People want everything immediately, effortlessly. You have to see the broader context of civilization. Our Western civilization, we has given us freedom, opportunities, progress, not as statistical measure, but as the ability to realize human potential. In my perspective, only anti-fragile human and people makes credit for 25 years.
Well said on both your parts. The question struck a deep chord with me as well, around credit risk management and banks and what have you, for a couple of reasons. One is it really points to skin in the game, if you will. How much skin in the game do the parties have, right? I mean, immediately, yes, both gentlemen are nodding. Immediately it points to that question of how much skin in the game is there. And then here's a very interesting way to think about this, because we have, I'll say, human beings in our society, we have been afforded a lot of freedom, a lot of right comfort, if you will. So if I look at it from skin in the game perspective, given the backdrop of where we are as we've evolved as human beings, the question is, how am I going to deal with credit and risk if I look at it as what's the potential of a crisis happening versus me able to survive it versus thrive versus die, if you will. What's the potential of a crisis, right? And then recast, as odd as that may sound, recast it from what are the benefits, right? What are the losses? Those are really the opportunities and the threats, if you will. How much can I sustain? How much can I sustain? Those are strengths and weaknesses. And then what decisions can be made based on all those factors. It's a very rich space. And I'll say, with a lens, exactly as Sebastian, you mentioned, the devil's in the details, the nuances. So use a lens to look at the problem space based on context, and then be able to derive an answer. So very, very great question that was posed.
Maybe it's the analog will be a bit different, but after the COVID crisis, it's quite interesting to look at the aerospace industry, because in most cases the planes do not fly.
Yeah.
But a lot of airplane companies, they are not owning the airplanes. They just leasing it or bought it for credit and so on. And it creates a chain between those lines and the banks that no one in this chain is, everyone is exposed for the risk. Everyone. So as I said, everyone has skin in the game. So there is no possibility that the bank could say, I will take all your planes, but what with them? Who will buy those planes, because the plane doesn't fly at all, and so on. That's why everyone is looking for ideas and how to resolve the problem with those credits and all the sector, and not trying to gain any profit from this, because as I said, everyone is involved. Every organization will lose if anything happened, and it's the perfect example of the skin in the game.
Yeah. And Sebastian and Peter, the same thing is being applied. The same question can be rephrased for supply chain. Same kind of question, right? Can be also for HR, human resources. We're going through the same kind of dynamics there, amongst other industries. So if I can add one thing, Sebastian, to what you just said as well, we also have to recognize that, and this is very deeply in anti-fragility, we also have to recognize that if the whole is going to remain and survive and thrive, there will be losses. So it doesn't mean that all the parts survive. There will be natural, respectfully, deaths in the ecosystem in order that the ecosystem sustain. This is a very, very key aspect of ecosystem thinking, and very much elaborated in both Skin in the Game and Anti-Fragile from Taleb's work. So gentlemen, I know we're coming up to the end of time. Are you good to kind of just give quick closing comments, and then we'll talk about next steps ever so quickly in the time that we have?
Okay, yeah.
Please.
Okay, so my idea about the risk management in today's world, and as I said at the beginning, it's so complicated and so non-linear that the concept I use for many years, so the probability and the impact, sometimes if it's a very fast changing environment and the ecosystem is very complicated, it's very hard to assess. That's why I'm rather thinking about the changing this whole concept or the whole idea of not assessing the probability, but rather looking at the impact of every event. because from this event you will know if those impact will harm you enough to kill you, or harm you that not very much will happen to you. So I look at this from this risk management perspective, cybersecurity perspective, privacy perspective, compliance perspective, and so on. So that I'm looking for the impact, not the probability.
Yep. Very well said. Very well said. Peter, my friend, closing comments.
In my perspective, answer is be responsible, be predictive. Look at an event not only in shortest possible perspective, but see its consequences from many sides, many aspects. A broad perspective allows you to develop and create not only innovative products, but responsible action. Build a more mature personality, mature character. This will make you stronger, and stronger people become immune to risk. They are anti-fragile. We welcome you to the Institute. We want to invite you to talk together, to deepen these issues together. So many great minds, beautiful minds, will surely achieve synergies effect together.
Well said. And if I had sort of a closing thought, I think this is the key that has driven anti-fragility. Is it is distinct from risk management, where risk management has really focused, if you will, on predictability, on probability, respectfully. But here, anti-fragility is not an absolute. You are not anti-fragile or fragile. You are actually more anti-fragile or more fragile. There are degrees and they're not absolute. So I think very, very key in focusing on the impact is exactly as you're both emphasizing, and likewise, Sebastian, as you introduced in the conversation, is extremely crucial. Not an absolute concept, definitively focusing on the impact, because we can't emphasize all probabilities. We can't derive all those things. And really dealing more with uncertainty than risk, as mentioned. To my last thought before just a few closing comments is, we are in a renaissance. The risk management community, the agile community, the resilience community, numerous communities are going through a renaissance. And here we've got the Institute to really advance us forward and contribute amongst other parties. Just a few sort of housekeeping comments as we close off. Thank you everyone for joining. Also, if you are interested, I know there's a question has come up about, can we get a certificate of sorts for attending this event and this particular conversation? We are open to offering an exposure certificate. If you are interested, just email us, and our email address is flashing on the screen. And what we'd really like to hear from you is kind of what major takeaways you got from this conversation. Very definitively. Also, in terms of sort of next steps and things that we're going to be doing, we're very, very interested in a community of practitioners, and we'll also be, of course, looking at training, certification, other things, but very much focused on working with a community of practitioners, not coming up with mere theory, but rather putting theory into practice and learning from practice to derive theory. So truly a community of practitioners where we can share and learn together and support each other as we contribute better to the world all around us. So with that, thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for all our guests. Until our next conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and see you on LinkedIn and our Antifragility group page.
Most definitely. Thank you.
Bye.